Okay, today we're going to start. I don't think we won't get as far as I wished we would, but we're going to start with the section that's the worms. Now, in your chart, that's are the three that are directly above the peripheral area. You have the platyhelminthes; those are the flatworms. Then you have the nematoda, are the roundworms, and then you have annelida, which are the segmented worms. So those are the three that we're going to talk about. Now I'm going to give you some characteristics that you can fill in that will apply to all three phyla at once. Yes?
So those are all the examples of them, like flatworms?
Oh, those are what they mean, but as far as examples, we can give you those if you want to have those right now, where it says we want you to put the names of the different organisms that fit into that phylum. So under platyhelminthes, you can write two things: tapeworms. Tapeworms, I think you probably heard of that. And the other one is planaria, Planaria, planaria. Okay, so those are going to be our two examples of platyhelminthes. There are others, but that's the two that we're going to talk about. Under nematoda, the two that we're going to give their scientific name for these, because they don't really have what I would say is a common name, you know. So under nematoda, you're going to put Ascaris, and it's spelled like this: Ascaris, Ascaris. And the other one is Trichinella, and it's Trichinella. Trichinella. I don't know if any of you have heard of trichinosis. You can get from eating improperly cooked pork. That would be what we're talking about there. And then under annelida, the two examples that we're going to talk about are earthworm, and the other one is leeches, Leeches, leeches. Okay, so let's go through some general characteristics that we'll be able to put in more than one of these categories. Okay, so these all have what I would call soft bodies. They don't have a hard shell or anything like that on the outside. They're worms, so they're all going to have some length to them, some longer than others, and then they're all legless. They don't move around because they have legs. They're all legless. Now, on the symmetry side, you can put this in all three of them. They all have bilateral symmetry, which means if you cut them from end to end, you can divide them into two halves. That's what we mean by bilateral symmetry. Okay, they do have a something that looks a little more definite, like a head end. They have one end that we often would call the head end. So under cephalization, you could say for annelida and nematoda, you could say they definite. You could just say definite. They have definite segmentation. You don't have to write that word, but just say definite. They definitely have a head end. If you've ever handled an earthworm, you know there's one end that's clearly different than the other end. Okay, that's the head end. The other, the Ascaris and the Trichinella, you probably haven't seen those. So then for platyhelminthes, they have a slight, I think the book says like a slight head region, because at that region we find like the eye spots and some other sensory organs as well. But they have a slight head region. So that's what you could put for platyhelminthes. Slight head region. Okay, now for germ layers, they all have 3 cell layers, and you can just write that for Annelida and Nematoda. They have 3 germ layers or 3 cell layers. When we look at the different slides, you'll be able to see what those layers are. They're very similar to the layers that we've seen in the 2 previous phyla. Then for platyhelminthes, you can also say 3 cell layers. They do have, if you want to add this, organs and systems develop from the cells that are in the mesoderm. You know, they do have that, but you don't have to add that part to it. And those are the common names for those 3 layers. So these names are very familiar. We have epidermis, we have gastroderm, which we've had before, and then the one in between, we've given it different names. Like in the sponges, we call it the mesenchyme. In the Cnidaria, we had mesoglia. Then here, the middle layer is called the mesoderm. Okay, so those, I think it'd be nice to add those parts to it. If you have the other parts, that's fine, but this is just identifying what those layers are. Yes,
Are
Len?
those layers for all of those?
Yes, they would be for all 3 of those phyla have those same layers. We give them the same names. Okay, so here on the right are, the top picture is the planaria, and the bottom picture is a tapeworm. And it can be, is capable of being as long as your digestive system is. So it can be, you know, like 20 feet long. Not very wide, but long. The planaria is a flatworm, and it's
Is Jasmine?
that she's in my 5th hour class.
Okay. Trying to find her.
Can't find her? So as far as maybe movement, you could probably put in there that about, well, I don't know if you want to add that, about being free living. The planaria are capable of living on their own, but the others are not, just because of how God made them. So the planaria is like this. It has kind of an arrowhead shape to its head. So that's a free-living one. The tapeworm is actually parasitic. So where you have method of obtaining food in the platyhelminthes, you could say like most of them are parasitic. Most are parasitic. For actually for both the human, for Nematoda and Platyhelminthes, you can say both of those that they're parasitic, and that means they live within other animals. So Nematoda, they all live inside, usually some parts of the animal. Sometimes in the digestive system, sometimes in the muscles of the animal, sometimes in the liver as well. Okay, now, so tapeworms are that. They're in a class we call Cystoda. And then there are the flukes. There's liver flukes. There's different kind of flukes. they are probably more similar to the planaria than they are to the tapeworms. But they are parasitic. They live inside of another animal, deriving their nourishment from that animal. So a planaria, we said it had 3 layers, and here are the layers that we talked about. The epidermis, the one on the outside, and then we have the inside that makes up the gastrovascular cavity is called the gastroderm, and then in between it sort of has, again, sort of like a jelly-like layer that we call the mesoderm. And in this you will find other tissues and organs in there. The planaria, how does it move? So this would be over in the movement section. The planaria has ciliated cells. In other words, the cilia on the bottom side of the planaria, that's what ventral means, the bottom side, helps it to move along. So it has cilia for moving. So the tapeworm doesn't move. It's just stuck inside your digestive system, or the digestive system of an animal. But the planaria is capable of moving around. What it does is it kind of secretes a slimy layer and then uses its cilia to kind of paddle through it. Yes?
So does cilia for moving would be enough for?
Yeah, cilia for movement for the planaria. Yeah, this is just the planaria, not the tapeworm one. Okay? Now, it does have a muscle layer. So in other words, it can change its shape with these muscles. It's capable of kind of like pulling itself together almost into like a round ball. Not quite, because the head end kind of sticks out. But it does have a muscle layer for movement. Now, how do they get their nutrition? Well, they actually have a mouth and a pharynx. Now, the pharynx is kind of like the throat, and it's sort of like a suction. Like it goes around and sucks up stuff off the bottom. So these, we would call those filter feeders. They're feeding off of dead, decaying material on the bottom, which we need that in our world, right? Something has to happen to it. It might as well be a living thing that can benefit from the energy that's still stored inside of it. Okay, so this is on the bottom side. Ventral means bottom side. The way I remember that the ventral is the bottom side is on the bottom of a jacket. You sometimes will have a slit, or they sometimes call it a vent slit, or like something of a vent. So that's why I just think it's on the bottom side. So they have a mouth, and then they have a pharynx, and they have an intestine. Okay, so this is quite different than what we've talked about up to this point. They actually have a structure whose job is to digest food. They do have an intestine. So this pharynx they stick this pharynx down through the mouth opening and suck up the food particles that move around inside of here, and they get digested. Okay, now as far as excretion, they actually have structures for excreting. So you could say for this planaria right here, and I should probably put it up, they actually have tubules where they collect all of this waste, and then they have a special kind of cell that helps filter out the liquid waste, like what we use to make our urine. They have to filter out that, and it kind of moves around a little bit like maybe like a flame flickering in the wind would be. So they call those flame cells right here that help absorb liquid waste. Okay, how do the planaria respond? Well, they have anterior, that's head end, they have nervous tissue. Well, actually, they have quite a concentration of that, of nerve tissue. This black in here is supposed to represent the nerves that it has, but there's a lot more, if you can see, in this head end than there is in the rest of it. So it has some nerves that run the full length of their little body from the end that we're going to call the head, because remember we said it has a head end, a slight head, not a slight head end, and these are the nerves, and then notice these black things in between. The two lateral nerves are actually connected to each other by transverse nerves. So it looks kind of like a ladder. That's sort of a ladder-like setup for their nervous system. Now, they have eye spots. Now, we only call them eye spots because they look like, since this is the head end, they kind of look like eyes, but are they for seeing? Probably for what? Yeah, just sensing light or dark. And I'm not sure exactly where it's going to probably the safer place for them to be would maybe be where it's darker. So they'll seek out the darker places so they're not going to become food for some other animal. But they have eye spots. So it just senses levels of light. Now, when it comes to reproduction for them, they can carry on asexual reproduction, and that is by regeneration. If you were to take a planaria, they're tiny, but if you would take a scalpel and cut it like this right through the middle of the head, then both halves of the head will grow the half they're missing. So now it'll have two heads, and in the rest of its life it'll have two heads. Now, just to check your understanding, would they be able to pass this off to their offspring? Yes or no? We have some doing like this and some that aren't shaking their head at all. Okay, they won't, because remember, this is not a change in the genetic code. This is just something that physically happens to you. Like if you lost your arm before you were married and had kids, they're not going to be born without an arm just because you lost your arm. It's that same thing here, regeneration. As far as sexual reproduction, they are a new word. Some of you may have heard it before, but a new word. It's called hermaphroditic. Hermaphroditic. What does that mean? That means planaria have both male and female reproductive organs in the same animal. Okay? There are other animals that are just like that. The earthworm, for instance, does the same thing. It has a male and a female part. So that's kind of common in these worms that we're talking about, to have both male and female, but not all of them. There's one of them, I think it's the ascaris, that actually there's a male ascaris and a female ascaris. But these are the ones that have both. The part I don't remember is, can they fertilize themselves? Can the egg and the sperm be both from the same animal? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. So let's talk a little bit more about those parasitic, not the planaria, but tapeworm. These, because they're parasitic, they have few sense organs as adults. So you can put in the nervous system, nervous system. You can put down for these that the parasitic flatworms have few sense organs. They don't have any need to. They're living inside of another animal. Their environment's perfect. They don't need to, there's nothing to sense. So they won't have many sense organs. They're not moving around. So in the movement part, you could say for the parasitic flatworms, they have no external cilia. They're not going anywhere. Everything's coming to them. The animal that they're living inside of is going to bring all the food to them. Perfect life, isn't it? And then they often have a thick tegument. Now this tegument is like a skin. Now, if they're living in the digestive system, what do you think should be happening to them? Shouldn't they be also be being digested? So they have a thick layer on the outside of them that keeps them from being digested, even though they're living in the intestines. We'll show you a picture here in a little bit of a tapeworm. To stay inside the intestine instead of getting passed out with the rest of the solid waste, they have little suckers and hooks where they can hook onto the inside of the intestine, so they don't, because your intestines move food along it as it's digesting, and it would go out if it wasn't for that. So they have ways of hooking onto the walls or sucking onto the walls of the intestine to keep from getting moved along. So that's how they prevent themselves from being pushed out. Okay, now there's another kind of flatworm we said were the flukes. Like there's a sheep liver fluke. If you want to study that it's I think the sheep liver fluke, if I remember right, has two parts of its life cycle. Part of it lives in a snail, and part of it lives in the sheep. And the sheep become infected because the snails, live on maybe on the grass, and they leave their waste behind. The sheep eat the grass with the waste and get them into their body. And so it kind of completes the whole life cycle. Okay, so here is like a diagram of a sheep liver fluke. It does have a mouth end for taking in food. It does have an intestine. Does not the elaborate intestine that planaria had, because most of its food is already in a form that it needs. Okay, you're dismissed.